Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is a lawyer, academic, and author. Aimée Craft is Anishinaabe, Métis from Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. She's the former Director of Research at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the founding Director of Research at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Aimée is also an award-winning author who recently co-edited the book In Our Backyard, Kiosk and the Legacy of Hydroelectric Development, which has just been released. Thanks so much for being with us this week on the show.
It's my pleasure.
Quite the resume there, but we barely scratched the surface even. But let's start with the book here that we have, In Our Backyard, that you recently co-edited with Jill Blakely. What can you tell us about In Our Backyard, Kiosk, and the Legacy of Hydroelectric Development? This
is the first time I've seen a physical copy of this book, so I just want to hold it because this book is just over 10 years in the making. It relates back to hearing at the Clean Environment Commission, and many experts and community witnesses testified on the impact of hydroelectric development. And the question that the CEC was asking is, are there going to be significant residual adverse effects of building this dam in the territory? And so the book explores all the dimensions of that and the different perspectives. And what we wanted to make sure happened is that all of the thoughtful information that was put forward in considering whether or not the dam should be built, that it not be lost, that it not be part of some abstract archive somewhere, but that the voices of the people, those who had understood and thought deeply about whether or not this dam should be built, would be preserved in this book. And to illustrate the range of perspectives, right? It's not sort of one uniform way of looking at hydroelectric development or at this dam itself.
Mm-hmm. And there are numerous voices, different people doing different chapters in the book. Can you tell us who's involved and I guess how you decided who should be included?
So there's a range of different authors and perspectives that are illustrated in the book. So we have more academic experts that are speaking to sort of biological, bioterrestrial markers, caribou and sturgeon and other species within the territory. And then there are the socioeconomic perspectives and then community voices. So there are first-hand witness accounts of different community members that testified from different First Nations that are affected by the hydroelectric development of Kiosk. And they talked about their own personal experience, impact on community, impact on their territory, and some of the loss that comes with this kind of development.
What would you say the role that hydroelectricity has played in the development of Manitoba as a province?
I think it's key to Manitoba's development as a province. It's kind of part of the identity of Manitoba, and since the 60s there are a variety of dams that have been built in northern Manitoba that have been controversial. So they've been the subject of a renegotiated agreement, the Northern Flood Agreement, and often this was on the backs of First Nations and with significant impact on lands, waters, territories in the north. And what's interesting is Manitoba has maintained the lowest hydro rates for consumers in Canada and very reasonable rates in terms of North America. And so understanding it from this perspective, what is the cost, not the financial cost to a consumer of hydro, but what's the cost of having hydroelectric development in the northern part of the province, right? Because most of it's consumed in the south, and most of it, or a lot of it, is also exported to export markets to generate revenue. But the impact is in the north. So we have a province that has, this history of low hydro rates, big development in northern Manitoba, and a growing export market. And that's kind of the big picture of hydro in Manitoba that we need to be conscious of. I think consumers in the south need to know that. And this book is about, situating Indigenous people in that northern landscape. And the title says it, right? In our backyard. And this is something that is very real, although people in the south might not see what's happening in the north.
Well, that was my next question. What has been the impact on Indigenous peoples from these hydro projects?
I think one of the largest impacts is actually flooding. And so we see a change in landscape, right? To generate power, you have to hold back water and release it strategically. So there's a lot of flooding associated with the building of a hydroelectric dam. And the impact is also socio and economic, because if you're flooding land, if you're building a mega dam, there's an impact on the wildlife, how animals move. There's an impact on vegetation. There's impacts on the loss of sound of rapids where dams are built. And that's one of the comments that came forward in the Kiosk hearing was, some of the elders said, if we lose the sound of this rapid, we lose a part of our cultural identity. And those are things that aren't often captured in environmental assessment, right? Mm-hmm. We don't think about, what it is to lose sound. But imagine losing something that's part of your daily fixture, that's part of your landscape, that's part of your home, that is your family. That changes things pretty significantly, and changes the way you travel and move and be with waterscapes.
And as I mentioned to you, right off when you open the book, there's a poem from former National Chief Ovid Mercredi that really touches on some of the things you said there, that really hits you hard and stops you in your tracks. In 2018, a Manitoba Clean Environment Commission report was made public and laid bare some of the allegations of the impacts on one community, Fox Lake Cree Nation, allegations of sexual assault, racism, economic and social impacts. As someone who was also yourself involved in the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, did the two kind of match up on what you were hearing in terms of big projects and the impacts on Indigenous peoples who live there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, what I was earlier referring to is sort of the impact of the dam once it's built. But the whole building process is pretty impactful. And one of the things that we critique in the book is sort of the staged approach to licensing and staged approach to building. Like you walk so far down this path in the pre-phase that you have to build it. But the building itself is impactful. And one of the realities is that to build a major dam like the Kiosk Dam, you're bringing in workers from all across Canada. You're having significant impact in communities. And there are some offsets with employment, jobs within construction camps and continuing work on the dam and its power generating abilities. But I think that we often underestimate what it's like to be in a remote community and then have the world descend upon Fox Lake, for example, and what that means for children and families and women, and the socioeconomics, cultural dynamics, and physical safety. And that's, you referred to Ovid Mercredi's poem at the beginning of the book, and he's from the community of Mispaistic Cree Nation, where Grand Rapids Dam was built in the 1960s. There's a whole generation of children that were born of hydro workers that then had to be integrated into the community in really difficult ways. And that's a reality that comes from that kind of northern development, a social reality that we can't ignore, right?
Exactly. Tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars have been paid out to First Nations in settlements by Manitoba Hydro or the province after the fact. What does that say to you about the policies in place that got these projects greenlit in the first place?
Well, if we think about the history of hydro in Manitoba, it went from zero consultation, we're doing this in your territory, you don't have a say, to now a new model of economic partnership. And that's kind of, it couldn't be done without consent anymore. It had to become something else. And that's this new model of being partners in a project, potentially benefiting from it. And, in some ways that's a positive development because it's including First Nations, but there's also a lot of impetus to say yes, and the community ratification processes and things like that, the economic incentives are all part of a bigger package. And you can be critical of that, and I think a lot of our authors in the book are critical. We invited Hydro to give us their perspective, and they declined to be part of the book project. But there is a range. There isn't sort of one way of looking at this, and I think that's the importance of having a book like this, is it illustrates all of these different perspectives and says, we've done this from the perspective of First Nations, we've done this, we've partnered, but we still have these concerns, which all of them raised as continuing concerns. But they've faced a reality. And many of them live with hydroelectric development already in their backyard with the other dams that are on the Nelson River. So this is kind of a continuation of a larger project. And it also situates itself in the optics of more potential development. Hydroelectric development in Manitoba could theoretically develop to double what it is now. And so we need to be really cautious about how we make decisions, who's involved in it, who benefits from those decisions.
Aimée, we're going to touch on many of the things that you just touched on there. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is lawyer, author, and much more, Aimée Craft, whose recent book here, In Our Backyard, Kiosk, and the Legacy of Hydroelectric Development. Aimée, the foreword of the book talks about how big energy projects today have never faced such uncertain pathways to success, and there are many examples of that. What was the process like, and was there much opposition, do you think, from what you've been hearing and reading to these hydro projects in Manitoba back in the 50s and 60s?
I think the landscape has changed, and actually the law has changed. And the law of consultation and accommodation in Canada requires that the Crown consult and accommodate where there's potential impact on the exercise of treaty and Aboriginal rights. And treaty and Aboriginal rights have only been part of Canada's Constitution since 1982, the recognition of them. So, you know, there's a very different landscape than there was in the 50s and 60s, where there was kind of this pro-development, let's go ahead, let's do this, it's good for the province, therefore it's good for everyone. And now we're in a different era. There's an era of reconciliation, there's constitutional recognition of rights, and there's also a better exchange or flow of information. So whereas, you know, in the north you may not have actually known much about a project before it happened, 40 years ago, now there's actually more publicly accessible information and a call for it. And that's part of environmental assessment in Canada. And so that change in landscape, the involvement of Indigenous nations as partners, is, you know, a significant shift in mega projects policy. And in those ways, you know, it's positive, but there is still a lot of resistance. And you know, some of the people that spoke at the Clean Environment Commission hearing on Kiosk said, "This is going to destroy my trapline. This is going to change how my family gathers on land. This is going to change my everyday activities, and it will have an impact on who I am as a Cree person." And that, you know, that is a very important voice that needs to be heard in those decision-making processes.
Companies, governments like to tout hydro as a clean source of energy. What do you say to that?
I think often hydro is categorized in the renewable resources category, but the impact on territory is long-term. So as much as water can cycle through and be reused, there's still a significant impact on shoreline erosion and on the quality of water within territories. And then the impact of, you know, the transmission lines. Once hydro is generated, it also has to be transmitted, and that's something that's quite significant when you're bringing power from northern Manitoba to southern Manitoba. So there's a whole wealth of biophysical impacts on the territory that have to be acknowledged as part of, you know, these hydroelectric developments. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about Kiosk specifically, as that's the title of the book here. A nearly $10 billion project that sees Manitoba Hydro partnering with 4 First Nations. What should people who don't know about this mega project know about it?
I think they need to know that you know, this isn't a handout to First Nations. They become partners in the project. They have to invest in the project. The returns are in a distant future, so this is not an immediate return. So there's a business arrangement here that's being made, and one that has a lot of risk associated to it as well. So, you know, the adverse effects that, you know, would have been 40 years ago that wouldn't have been compensated for are partially compensated, but also part of that compensation model or the benefit model is to be partners. But it's risky. And a lot of it is driven by the fact that there's an inclination to think that this is going to happen anyway, and it has happened on the Nelson River many times for many of the communities involved. They're already in the shadow of a dam. So one more, I think there's a thought that why not profit from it? And that's a very important question, and one that's debated and contested within communities and amongst families even. And that's, I think, what people should know about hydroelectric development in Manitoba is it's still impactful, it's still risky, it's often driven by export markets and providing low energy to the south, and it's being done in Indigenous territory, and it has been less beneficial in the past and continues to be controversially potentially beneficial.
When we were talking about the the Clean Water Commission there and what happened in the 50s and 60s to Fox Lake, this project too, Kiosk, has been hit with cost overruns, allegations of sexual assaults, charges laid, allegations of racism. Nearly 30,000 people worked on this project. That's more people than some of the communities I've lived in. Was nothing learned from? It seems like all the same problems that happened decades ago are still happening with projects being done today.
I think, when you're bringing in people to build a dam from all over Canada that are used to a camp culture, there's a lot of that even with information and training and sensitivity training, cultural sensitivity training, that is difficult to undo. And I think it needs a really concerted effort from the top down, all throughout the structures of decision makers and employers, and that's really challenging. And a lot of having worked at the inquiry, one of the primary questions that we asked about Indigenous women is what allows for the devaluation of Indigenous women's lives, and it's very similar in thought to what allows us to devalue land or to extract from land. Is it's seen as being something to be taken up by someone who has more power. And so, there's interesting parallels there between what we do to the land and what we allow, what we do to women in these types of camps. So I think a concerted effort to think about and put action to how do we keep our communities safe while we're going through this process of building and then operating these dams. That's a critical question and a core one for leadership in all 4 of the affected communities and any other community that has this kind of development in its backyard.
We talk about the partnership here with the 4 First Nations, and earlier this year the partner First Nations said they wanted to update the original agreement, saying that financial returns promised are unlikely to ever materialize here. The chief of York Factory wrote, once again, the adverse effects of yet another major hydroelectric project have been imposed on remote Indigenous peoples for the benefit of distant non-Indigenous governments and peoples. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
I immediately think of treaties and the idea of making a treaty to live well together, and the idea of renewal and responsibility and reciprocity and what it is to be in good relations, and understanding that there are going to be shifting circumstances. And many of us pointed out in the original hearings at the Public Utilities Board and the Clean Environment Commission that there was risk associated with this kind of financial arrangement. And I think we're seeing that materialize in our current circumstances. And the reality is, when there is a shift, the honor of the Crown applies. And Manitoba Hydro is a Crown corporation. So I would say, if there is a need to revisit the benefit to the different nations that were involved as partners, then that should be, to me, it would be a no-brainer. To me, it would be upholding the honor of the Crown. I'm not a corporate commercial lawyer, and there's probably a variety of contractual reasons that would allow you to escape that. But right. Remembering that this is a Crown corporation, it's a corporation that represents all of the Crown's interests in Manitoba and the people of Manitoba ultimately, and maintaining good relationships and acknowledging the impact on Indigenous nations in the North is important. If we're actually committed to reconciliation as a province, then that's a conversation that should be had amongst the partners in that development to ensure that there is some kind of benefit for Northern First Nations.
Aimée, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is lawyer, author, and more, Aimée Craft. And Aimée, we've been focused on Manitoba here, but this could really apply to First Nations or Indigenous peoples in any other province with mega projects like this, could it not?
Absolutely, and around the world, and that's right. A reality. Mega projects, extractivism is happening in our backyard, but also internationally. And Jill Blakely, who's the co-editor of this book, is also a co-editor with me on Mega Projects book, where we're exploring 3 hydroelectric developments in Canada, so Muskrat Falls, Site C, and Kiosk, as well as Ring of Fire developments, to think about, when you're doing mega projects, how do you make decisions? What is good development, and what are the principles of decision making, and what do we need to think about to make this fit into our current imperative of reconciliation? So that book's coming out next year, and we're really excited about the conversations that are happening around that, both in the book, but also in the broader impact assessment community and environmental evaluation communities in Canada.
I understand you have another book as well that we should touch on here.
Yeah, well, so, if you think about all of this, it's in the abstract, but it actually is based on treaty relationships, and that's so important in our Manitoba context, understanding what treaties mean, honoring them, and understanding concepts like reciprocity, renewal, and respect that are so foundational. And the children's book actually talks about how those relationships are modeled on what we see in our natural environment. And it's beautifully illustrated by Luke Swinson, and it's meant to be read as families and for each person that reads it, especially young people, to see themselves as these people that can uphold these sets of values that are gifted to us by creation and that we model our good behavior and our relationships on.
Well, it sounds great, and really looking forward to that next book as well on those projects. Aimée, thanks so much for coming here and talking with us about it, and good luck tonight. Yeah, the book launch for this one is tonight, so good luck with that. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It was great to chat with you.
And that's all the time we have for this week's show. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. This episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts, and you can find those wherever you download your podcasts. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week for the season finale of Face to Face.